entrepreneurship, a magical word in our times. But it wasn't always the case. Just a few years ago, when you said someone that you're an entrepreneur, you were getting reactions like, oh, so you couldn't find a job. But now we can say confidently that this doesn't have to be the case. Entrepreneurship can also be born by seeking opportunities. So in this course, I'll be talking entrepreneurship from an opportunity perspective, and I will be talking about the principles of lean startup, business model generation, and business model canvas. It will be based on experimentation, learning, and research. The previous entrepreneurship literature takes entrepreneurship as a management itself, but the recent successful examples of the startups show us that there is more to the entrepreneurship teaching. So let's start with the definition of entrepreneurship. So we can say that entrepreneurship definitely should involve opportunity. But what else do we have? Then let's also talk more about who is an entrepreneur. So what kind of a person is he? So I can say an entrepreneur is like an artist. When we look at the paintings of an artist, so at first we just see just a few strokes, and when we look at the strokes, they look like nothing. We can say, how come such a beautiful, how come beautiful paintings come from these strokes? But at the end, we are amazed, we are surprised with the outcome. Beautiful paintings come out of the artist's minds and hands. So an entrepreneur is like that. He has a vision, he has perseverance, and then he is committed to learning, understanding, and implementing the best solution for the customers that he has chosen. So Howard Stevenson, an Harvard Business School professor, defines entrepreneurship with these characteristics. He says entrepreneurship is the pursuit of opportunity beyond resources that you currently control. Because life has its ups and downs, and it's very true for the startups, for the new companies. And for the existing companies that you are an employee, it's a controlled environment. The company knows what to do. It already has some customers, and you have your specific job. But in an entrepreneurial setting, you are the one who has to deal with the uncertainties, the unknown. So it seems more like a risk for the people, but for the founder, for the entrepreneur, he knows it will be a beautiful painting at the end, like the artist knows. So a startup founder, an entrepreneur, needs to continue his search, his pursuit of opportunity under the times of extreme uncertainty, or when there are stuff which he cannot control. So he has to admit that there are things that he cannot control. So he cannot manage. And the single most important lesson from this definition is the opportunity is the only real resource for the entrepreneur. Why is that important? Because for an entrepreneur, he needs to attract, first of all, customers. He needs to attract shareholders. He needs to attract investors. He needs to attract employees. So all these people will be attracted to the idea just because it gives hope, just because it solves problems. So the entrepreneur's job is to make the opportunity as vivid, as colorful as possible, because it's the only resource that the entrepreneur has. He doesn't have any money beginning. He doesn't have huge resources like the big companies have. So an entrepreneur needs to have inside motivation to continue his perseverance during this roller coaster journey. And now let's look at the definition of a startup. Actually, it's the hype word which is coupled with the word entrepreneurship, but I believe that we need to differentiate between the two definitions or two different terminology. One hand startup, another is new companies. So is each new company a startup? Can we call a company just because it has recently started a startup? So what is the difference between a startup and between a new company? Is startups smaller versions of the big companies? Actually, that's a big question. And the entrepreneurship literature so far assumed, yes, that's the case. I mean, all companies are the same. Even they are recently founded, even they are small, new, or large or old, they are the same. So you can apply traditional management practices. But the recent research on lean startup methodology, customer development progress have shown us that they are actually different. A startup can be defined as a team launching a new product under conditions of extreme uncertainty, according to the author of The Lean Startup, Eric Ries. And he's saying that, I mean, a startup is not necessarily a new company, but it's just a team. It can be within a large company, or it can just happen to be a new company. But the thing is, a startup operates under extreme uncertainty. And secondly, he defines startup as a vehicle for testing hypotheses and assumptions for such an entity. So a startup is not a formalized company yet. A startup is just a team which needs to find out the validity of the idea, of the opportunity, if the opportunity is valid or not. That's the startup's job. And also, different than the company, a startup needs to move faster than any other company, because it needs to prove itself as fast as possible. Once it finds the market, once it shows there is product market fit, then the startup goes into a different stage, which is scaling and becoming a larger company. But until that stage, a startup is very different from an established company. That's really important. That's a big idea. And I would like to give you also another definition about success. So I love this definition by Winston Churchill, saying that success is going from failure to failure without loss of any enthusiasm. So as we said, an entrepreneur has a vision like an artist. So he would like to build his startup like a painting. And during those stages, there will be failed attempts. These are inevitable. These are unavoidable. And you as the entrepreneur should be prepared and also should be willing to fail as fast as possible and as much as possible. When you look at the painters, you will see that there are many not very beautiful paintings. There are many scratches, and there are many draft paintings. But what you see at the end is just one beautiful painting. But until that, I mean, he has worked a lot. He has drafted a lot. It's the same. It's the case for the startups and entrepreneurs as well. Look at the two pictures. One of them shows the ship is trying to jump from one side to the other, but in the first cartoon, he has no chance to fail because, I mean, there is not a safety net. I mean, it's like the big companies which has established plans, which has established business plans for 5-year forecasts, 10-year plans, for a huge initiative that they believe it will be successful. And we have lots of examples in history. For example, the Palm Initiative by HP during the 90s. They were so confident that it was going to be successful. That's why they spent hundreds of millions of dollars with this assurance. But at the end, it turned out, I mean, it was not as successful as they expected. So they failed and they didn't try again. Because the new initiative was not set to learn. It was set to execute. However, in the second cartoon, you see that now failure is an option because there's a safety net. In the example of HP, if instead of spending hundreds of millions of dollars, if they would spend hundreds of thousands of dollars maybe, or just a few million dollars according to Sickle, then they would have learned from their experience and they would have other chances to try with different initiatives. Now, failure is an option in this case because there is safety and there is chance to learn. So with the lean startup perspective, with the opportunity-seeking entrepreneur, now that's what we'll be trying to do during our endeavors. Because our endeavors will be full of ups and downs, will be full of uncertainties. Uncertainties are the things that are unknown. However, risk is something that we can measure. So if we learn, if we have our metrics at the beginning, and if we constantly look for those metrics, we can assess our risk and we can decide based on our risk averseness, we can decide our agenda and our plan. Risk can be managed, however, uncertainty is just an unknown. So you need to turn your uncertainties into risks. So entrepreneurship is also management, and here our goal is to create an institution, not just a product. That's really different than building a product in a company. Within a company, when we build a new product, we can call it a sustaining innovation because it is consistent with our existing distribution channels, existing marketing channels, and existing organization. But in a startup setting, we create everything from scratch. So it's not just the product. Here, traditional management practices fail because traditional practices are for the known markets and for the known customers and for the known solutions within the existing setup. So we need practices and principles adjusted to the startup context of extreme uncertainty. So a startup itself is like a Play-Doh. As I say, you play with it. So the aim is to create the institution at the end, not just the product. Think about this analogy. And also, look at the example from the early days of Facebook. From the movie The Social Network, maybe most of you have seen, or if not, I suggest you to watch the movie. In one scene, you see that Eduardo Saverin asked Mark Zuckerberg about when they are going to make money. Okay, he says, we should start immediately to sell ads so we can make some money. But at that instance, Mark says, no. We do not yet know what we currently have. Because the perspective tells us that the owner of the product, the owner of the company are not the founders. Instead, the owners are the users, the visitors, the customers. They will say the final word. So until they prove the product market fit, until they prove there is market demand, market validation, they didn't ask for any money. They didn't look for any monetization options. That's a good example as well. So traditional management practices have some shadow beliefs like we know what customers want. We can accurately predict the future. And the progress is just advancing the plan. So you all know those from your current companies as well during your work experience. These might be valid if you really know your customers and your environment, but these are not valid in a startup setting. So here, advancing the plan, so there are some methodologies. One of them is the waterfall planning, another one is build it and they will come. Just build the perfect product, which you might recognize from the concepts that we discussed in the marketing lecture as the product concept. You try to build the perfect product and you think, okay, anyway, they will use this product because it's just perfect. Or another option is just do it. We do not know, just do it and we'll see if it works or not. But these are also part of advancing the plan, and these are also part of the shadow beliefs. Waterfall planning looks like that, and it's part of the traditional product development process. It's like you first define requirements, and then specifications, and then design, and then implementation, verification, and then the final stage, maintenance. So it's like a serial, it's full of serial tasks during the planning process. So you go step by step because you know the problem and you know the solution. So your task is advancing to the next stage. So you try to complete the existing stage as soon as possible. So that's the traditional product development process. And I argue, or the recent entrepreneurship literature on lean startup and customer development argues, that product development model fails. Because startups do not become unsuccessful because they do not have products. They become unsuccessful because they lack customers and financial model. So the product development model does not tell us about these customers and financial models. It's just focused on advancing the plan. And Ash Maurya, who is also working on lean startup, says life is too short to build something that nobody wants. So that's the risk in traditional product management process. So other reasons for the failure in product development might be the product delivery date. So it might be too soon or too late. So you just define a delivery date and you just execute it just because you have to. Even if you learn from customers or not, you have to deliver it by that date. Instead of discovery and learning, it's focused on implementation. But beware, what you think you know is not what you really know. It's different. What you might think you know about the customers, but it is the customers who know what they want, and your task is to learn from them. And another one is the lack of marketing metrics. So you need to constantly measure the metrics and you need to behave accordingly. And finally, in the product development practices, there might be some unrealistic expectations from the product, like the case of HP in their Palm initiative. So they might have huge expectations from an untested product or from not sufficiently tested product. Now let me show you how customer development model looks like. It starts with the process of customer discovery. So at first stage, you try to understand if there are any customers in the market which might be willing to use any product, so which are aware if they have a problem or not. Your task is to understand what their problem is and who they are. And second stage is customer validation. After you identify the customers, you provide a minimum viable product, a product that will allow you to test if the customers are real. So you validate the customers, and then the third stage is customer creation. So you build a better version of the product and you try to attract more people if they are willing to use. And at this stage, you can prove the product market fit. You prove that your product has a market over there and they demand your product. Now you can start scaling your product. If you do scaling before, like many companies, like many startups, you have the risk of premature scaling. So the premature scaling will limit your ability to reach many other people and will cause you a lot if you need to change anything in the company. Just think about it like a copying machine. In the scaling, you copy what works with your startup. But if you start copying earlier, before finishing your playing with the Play-Doh example, you will risk changing it later in different copies as well. So in this customer development model, our unit of progress is validated learning. And in this case, the problem is unknown, and the solution is unknown. So the solution part is similar to the agile development processes, which might be familiar to the people who are coming from a software background or computer engineering background. And in the customer development model, our task is to find out where is the market, who are the customers, how do we set up the right team, how do we scale sales. So any team that develops a new product, can be either a small startup or a large corporation, can implement this customer development process versus product development process. So the customer development model or the lean startup practices avoid waste of capital and time. So instead of developing the perfect product and waiting the customers to come and find and use your product, you just have to chance to experience it before with a minimum viable product by failing more and often as soon as possible. So our task is to rapidly and iteratively test hypotheses and refine. We are not trying to be cheap, we are trying to be lean. So even if you have tons of money, even if you are a fat startup, even if you are a huge corporation, you do not have to spend huge sums of money. Even if you are Boeing, which has billions of dollars, you do not have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to test a new airplane. You can do it with smaller chunks, with spending smaller amounts of money. That's the beauty in the lean startup methodology. It's about optimizing, it's not about minimizing. And it's also about speed. It allows us to learn as soon as possible. So it's not a cost reduction strategy. It's a strategy, it's a practice to make our startup to be sustainable as long as possible. And to define the principles of lean startup, as we said before, it's about launching early and failing often. You do not have to wait for the perfect product. Once I visited the building of Facebook, and there was a saying on the wall which I liked a lot. It says, "Done is better than perfect." So which is true for the lean startup practices. So we are concentrated, we are focused on validation of business model hypotheses, which are based on rigorous experiments and clear metrics. So we provide minimum viable product instead of a finished perfect product, which has some features which are required but not perfect. And our job is to rapidly pivot our MVP, minimum viable product, or business model until you have validation and product market fit. And also, we do not scale until we have product market fit. That's an important point. Finally, this is the loop for the lean startup from Eric Ries. So it's a loop of building, measuring, and learning. Build, measure, learn, which involves iterating, evaluating, and analysis. That's what we should do as an entrepreneur in a lean startup setting.